For independent work today, you are reading chapters 28 through 30. As you're listening to me read Holes today, I want you to be writing down the main events that take place in your notebook. After the reading, post a picture of your notes to Seesaw. So this exact picture is also posted on Seesaw, and you'll be able to post your picture of your notes right in that activity. So again, right now, pause the video to get a notebook and pencil so that you can write down all of the main ideas as they take place in your notebook. And by the end, you'll be able to post a picture. It might even be a good idea when a main event is happening or something important that you want to write down to just pause the video so you can write it down and then play it again once you're done. Let's begin. After 20 years, Kate Barlow returned to Green Lake. It was a place where nobody would ever find her, a ghost town on a ghost lake. The peach trees had all died, but there were a couple of small oak trees still growing by an abandoned cabin. The cabin used to be on the eastern shore of the lake. Now the edge of the lake was over 5 miles away, and it was little more than a small pond full of dirty water. She lived in the cabin. Sometimes she could hear Sam's voice echoing across the emptiness. Onions, sweet, fresh onions. She knew she was crazy. She knew she'd been crazy for the last 20 years. Oh, Sam, she would say, speaking into the vast emptiness. I know it's hot, but I feel so very cold. My hands are cold. My feet are cold. My face is cold. My heart is cold. And sometimes she would hear him say, I can fix that. And she'd feel his warm arm across her shoulders. She'd been living in the cabin about 3 months when she was awakened one morning by someone kicking open the cabin door. She opened her eyes to see the blurry end of a rifle 2 inches from her nose. She could smell Trout Walker's dirty feet. You've got exactly 10 seconds to tell me where you've hidden your loot, said Trout, or else I'll blow your head off. She yawned. The redhead woman was there with Trout. Kate could see her rummaging through her cabin, dumping drawers and knocking things from the shelves of the cabinets. The woman came to her. Where is it? She demanded. Linda Miller, asked Kate. Is that you? Linda Miller had been in the 4th grade when Kate Barlow was still a teacher. She had been a cute, freckle-faced girl with beautiful red hair. Now her face was blotchy and her hair was dirty and scraggly. It's Linda Walker now, said Trout. Oh, Linda, I'm so sorry, said Kate. Trout jabbed her throat with the rifle. Where's the loot? There is no loot, said Kate. Don't give me that, shouted Trout. You've robbed every bank from here to Houston. You better tell him, said Linda. We're desperate. You married him for money, didn't you? Asked Kate. Linda nodded. But it's all gone. It dried up with the lake, the peach trees, the livestock. I kept thinking, it has to rain soon. The drought can't last forever. But it just kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Her eyes fixed on the shovel, which was leaning again up against the fireplace. She's buried it, she declared. I don't know what you're talking about, said Kate. There was a loud blast as Trout fired his rifle just above his head. The window behind her shattered. Where is it buried? He demanded. Go ahead and kill me, Trout, said Kate, but I sure hope you like to dig, because you're going to be digging for a long time. It's a big, vast wasteland out there. You and your children and their children can dig for the next 1,000 years and you'll never find it. Linda grabbed Kate's hair and jerked her head back. "Oh, we're not going to kill you," she said. "But by the time we're finished with you, you're going to wish you were dead." "I've been wishing I was dead for the last 20 years," said Kate. They dragged her out of bed and pushed her outside. She wore blue silk pajamas. Her turquoise-studded black boots remained beside her bed. They loosely tied her legs together so she could walk, but she couldn't run. She made her walk barefoot on the hot ground. They wouldn't let her stop walking. "Not until you take us to the loot," said Trout. Linda hit Kate on the back of her legs with a shovel. "You're going to take us to it sooner or later. You might as well make it sooner." She walked away, then the other. She walked one way, then the other, until her feet were black and blistered. Whenever she stopped, Linda whacked her with the shovel. "I'm losing my patience," warned Trout. She felt the shovel jab her back. She fell hard onto the dirt. "Get up," ordered Linda. Kate struggled to her feet. "We're being easy on you today," said Trout. "It's just going to keep getting worse and worse for you until you take us to it." "Look out!" shouted Linda. A lizard leaped toward them. Kate could see its big red eyes. Linda tried to hit it with a shovel, and Trout shot at it, but they both missed. The lizard landed on Kate's bare ankle. Its sharp black teeth bit her into her leg. Its white tongue lapped up the droplets of blood that leaked from the wound. Kate smiled. There was nothing they could do to her anymore. "Start digging," she said. "Where is it?" Linda screeched. "Where do you bury it?" Trout demanded. Kate Barlow died laughing. We are now entering into part 2 of the story, and this part is called The Last Hole, and it starts with chapter 29. There was a change in the weather, for the worse. The air became unbearably humid. Stanley was drenched in sweat. Beads of moisture ran down the handle of his towel, and it was almost as if the temperature had gotten so hot that the air itself was sweating. A loud boom of thunder echoed across the empty lake. This storm was way off to the west beyond the mountains. Stanley could count more than 30 seconds between the flash of lightning and the clap of thunder. That was how far away the storm was. Sound travels a great distance across a barren wasteland. Usually, Stanley couldn't see the mountains this time of day. The only time they were visible was just at sunup, before the air became hazy. Now, however, the sky was very dark off to the west, and every time the lightning flashed, the dark shape of the mountains would briefly appear. "Come on, rain," shouted Armpit. "Blow this way. Maybe it'll rain so it will fill up. Maybe it will rain so hard it will fill up the whole lake," said Squid. "We can go swimming." 40 days and 40 nights, said X-Ray. "Guess we better start building an ark." "Get 2 of each animal, right?" "Right," said Zigzag. 2 rattlesnakes, 2 scorpions, 2 yellow spotted lizards. The humidity, or maybe the electricity in the air, made Zigzag's head even more wild-looking. His frizzy blonde hair stuck almost straight out. The horizon lit up with a huge web of lightning. In that split second, Stanley thought he saw an actual rock formation at the top of one of the mountain peaks. The peak looked to him exactly like a giant fist, with the thumb sticking straight up. Then it was gone, and Stanley wasn't sure whether he'd seen it or not. "I found refuge on God's thumb." That was what his great-grandfather had supposedly said after Kate Barlow had robbed him and left him stranded in the desert. No one ever knew what he meant by that. He was delirious when he said it. But how could he live for 3 weeks without food or water? Stanley had asked his father. "I don't know. I wasn't there," replied his father. I wasn't born yet. My father wasn't born yet. My grandmother, your great grandmother, was a nurse in the hospital where they treated him. He'd almost always talk about how she'd dab his forehead with a cool, wet cloth. He said that's why he fell in love with her. He thought she was an angel. A real angel? His father didn't know. What about after he got better? Did he ever say what he meant by God's thumb or how he survived? No, he blamed his no good, pig stealing father. The storm moved off further west, along with any hope of rain. But the image of the fist and thumb, remained in Stanley's head, although instead of lightning flashing behind the thumb, in Stanley's mind, the lightning was coming out of the thumb as if it were the thumb of God. The next day was Zigzag's birthday, or as he said it, or so he said. Zigzag lay his cot as everyone headed outside. I get to sleep in because it's my birthday. Then a little while later, he cut into the breakfast line just in front of Squid. Squid told him to go to the end of the line. Hey, it's my birthday, Zigzag said, staying where he was. No, it's not your birthday, said Magnet, who was studying behind Squid. It is too, said Zigzag, July 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone the date. Could have been July 8th. It could have been July 8th. How would Zigzag know? He tried to figure out how long he'd been at Camp Green Lake. If indeed it was July 8th. I came here on May 24th, he said aloud. So that means I've been here 40 days, said Zero. Stanley was still trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He looked at Zero. He learned not to doubt him when it came to math. 40 days. It felt more like 1,000. He didn't dig a hole that first day, and he hadn't dug one yet today. That meant he dug 44 holes. If it really was July 8th. Can I have an extra carton of juice? Zigzag asked Mr. Sir. It's my birthday. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. Hole number 45. The 45th hole is the hardest, he said to himself. But that really wasn't true, and he knew it. He was a lot stronger than he was when he first arrived. His body had adjusted somewhat to the heat and the harsh conditions. Mr. Stir was no longer depriving him of water after having to get by on less water for a week or so. Stanley now felt like he had all the water he could want. Of course, it helped that Zero dug some of his hole for him each day, but that wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He always felt awkward while Zero was digging his hole, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually, he stood around a while before sitting down by himself on the hard ground, with the sun beating down on him. It was a lot better than digging, but not a lot better. When the sun came up a few hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God in the mountains. The mountains were a little more than dark shadows on the horizon. He thought he could make out a spot where the top of the mountain seemed to jut upward, but it didn't seem very impressive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden behind the glare of the sun reflecting off the dirty air. It was possible, he realized, that he was somewhere near where Cape Barlow had robbed his great-grandfather. If that was really her lipstick tube he found, then she must have lived somewhere around here. Zero took his turn before lunch break. Stanley climbed out of his hole and Zero climbed down into it. Hey, caveman, said Zigzag. You should get a whip If your slave doesn't dig fast enough, you can crack it across his back. He's not my slave, said Stanley. We have a deal, that's all. A good deal for you, said Zigzag. It was Zero's idea, not mine. Don't you know, Zig? Said X-Ray, coming over. Caveman's doing Zero a big favor. Zero likes to dig holes. He was sure a nice guy to let Zero dig his hole for him, said Squid. Well, what about me? Asked Armpit. I like to dig holes too. Can I dig for you, Caveman, after Zero's finished? No other boys laughed. No, I want to, said Zigzag. It's my birthday. Stanley tried to ignore them. Zigzag kept at it. Come on, Caveman, be a pal. Let me dig your hole. Stanley smiled, as if it were all a big joke. When Mr. Pendanski arrived with water and lunch, Zigzag offered Stanley his place in line. Since you're so much better than me. Stanley remained where he was. I didn't say I was, but you're insulting him, Zig, said X-Ray. Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us. Aren't you, Caveman? No, said Stanley. Sure you are, said X-Ray. Now come to the front of the line where you belong. That's okay, said Stanley. No, it's not okay, said X-Ray. Get up here. Stanley hesitated, then moved to the front of the line. Well, this is a first, Mr. Pendanski said, coming around the side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed him a sack lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad he'd be digging his own hole the rest of the day. Maybe the boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole for him anymore. But he needed to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into a sandwich, which contained some kind of meat and cheese mixture that came from a can. Just about everything at Green Lake came in a can. The supply truck came once a month. He glanced up to see Zigzag and Squid walking toward him. I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole, said Zigzag. Squid laughed. Here, take my cookie, said Zigzag, holding it out for him. No thanks, said Stanley. Come on, take my cookie, said Zigzag, sticking it in his face. Leave me alone, said Stanley. Please eat my cookie, said Zigzag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away. Zigzag pushed him back. Don't push me. I didn't. Stanley got on his feet. He looked around. Mr. Pendanski was filling Zero's canteen. Zigzag pushed him again. I said, don't push me. Zigzag took a step back, carefully avoiding Zero's hole. Zigzag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, quit pushing. Lay off, said Armpit, as he, Megman, and X-Ray joined them. Why should he? Snapped X-Ray. Caveman's bigger. He can take care of himself. I don't want any trouble, Stanley said. Zigzag pushed him hard. Eat my cookie, he said. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Pendanski coming toward them, along with Zero. Hi. Hi, Mom, said Armpit. We're just fooling around. I saw what was going on, Mr. Pendanski said. He turned to Stanley. Go ahead, Stanley, he said. Hit him back. You're bigger. Stanley stared at Mr. Pendanski in astonishment. Teach the bully a lesson, said Mr. Pendanski. Zigzag hit Stanley on the shoulder with his open hand. Teach me a lesson, he challenged. Stanley made a feeble attempt to punch Zigzag. Then he felt a flurry of fists against his head and neck. Zigzag had hold of his collar with one hand and was hitting him with the other. The collar ripped and Stanley fell backwards onto the dirt. That's enough, Mr. Pendanski yelled. That wasn't enough for Zigzag. He jumped on top of Stanley. Stop, shouted Mr. Pendanski. The side of Stanley's face was pressed flat into the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zigzag's fist slammed off his arms and pounded into his face into the ground. All he could do was wait for it to be over. Then suddenly Zigzag was off of him. Stanley managed to look up, and he saw that Zero had his arm around Zigzag's long neck. Zigzag made a gagging sound as he desperately tried to pry Zero's arm off of him. "You're going to kill him!" shouted Mr. Pendanski. Zero kept squeezing. Armpit charged into them, freeing Zigzag from Zero's chokehold. The three boys fell to the ground in different directions. Mr. Pendanski fired his pistol into the air. The other counselors came running from the office tents or out on the lake. They had their guns drawn, but holstered them when they saw trouble was over. The warden walked over from her cabin. "There was a riot," Mr. Pendanski told her. "Zero almost strangled Ricky." The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. Then she turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. "What happened to you?" "Nothing. It wasn't a riot." "Ziggy was beating up the caveman," said Armpit. "Then Zero started choking Zigzag, and I had to pull Zero off Zigzag. It was all over before Mom fired his gun." "They just got a little hot, that's all," said X-Ray. "You know how it is. In the sun and all day, people get hot, right?" "Everything's cool now." "I see," said the warden said. She turned to Zigzag. "What's the matter? Didn't get a puppy for your birthday?" "Zig's just a little hot," said X-Ray. "Out in the sun all day, you know how it is. The blood starts to boil." "Is that what happened, Zigzag?" asked the warden. "Yeah," said Zigzag. Like X-Ray said, working so hard in the hot sun while Caveman just sits around doing nothing. My blood boiled. "Excuse me," said the warden. "Caveman digs his holes like everyone does." Zigzag shrugged. "Sometimes." "Excuse me?" "Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day," said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to Zero. "I'm teaching him to read and write," said Stanley. "It's sort of a trade. The hole still gets dug, so what does it matter who digs it?" "Excuse me?" said the warden. "Isn't it important for him to learn to read?" Stanley asked. "Doesn't that build character more than digging holes?" "That's his character," said the warden. "What about your character?" Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden turned to Zero. "Well, Zero, what have you learned so far?" Zero said nothing. "Have you just been digging Caveman's holes for nothing?" the warden asked. "He likes to dig holes," said Mr. Pendanski. "Tell me what you learned yesterday," said the warden. "Surely you can remember that." Mr. Pendanski laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, "You might as well try to teach this shovel to read. It's got more brains than Zero." "The at sound," said Zero. "The at sound," repeated the warden. "Well then, excuse me, what does CAT spell?" Zero glanced around uneasily. Stanley knew he knew the answer. Zero just didn't like answering questions. "Cat," Zero said. Mr. Pendanski clapped his hands. "Bravo, bravo, the boy's a genius." "FAT?" asked the warden. Zero thought a moment. Stanley had taught him the F sound. Zero whispered, "At, fat." "How about HAT?" said the warden. Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound either. Stanley concentrated hard, then said, "Chat." All the counselors laughed. "He's a genius, all right," said Mr. Pendanski. "He's so stupid he doesn't even know he's stupid." Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pendanski seemed to have it in for Zero. If Mr. Pendanski only thought about it, he'd realize it was very logical for Zero to think that the letter H made the ch sound. "Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's holes," said the warden. "And no more reading lessons." "I'm not digging another hole," said Zero. "Good," said the warden. She turned to Stanley. "You know why you're digging holes?" "Because it's good for you. It teaches you a lesson. If Zero digs your hole for you. You're not learning that your lesson, are you? I guess not, Stanley mumbled, although he knew they weren't digging just to learn a lesson. She was looking for something that belonged to Kissing Kate Barlow. Why can't I dig my own hole but still teach Zero to read? He asked. What's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that, the warden said. It leads to trouble. Zero almost killed Zigzag. It causes him stress, said Mr. Pendanski. I know you mean well, Stanley, but face it, Zero's too stupid to learn to read. That's what makes his blood boil, not the hot sun. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Mr. Pendanski handed him the shovel. Here, take it, Zero. It's all you'll ever be good for. Zero took the shovel. He swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blade smashed across Mr. Pendanski's face. His knees crumbled beneath him. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The counselors all drew their guns. Zero held the shovel out in front of him as if he were going to try to bat away the bullets. I hate digging holes, he said. He slowly backed away. Don't shoot him, said the warden. He can't go anywhere. The last thing we need is an investigation. Zero kept backing up. Out past the cluster of holes the boys had been digging, then farther and farther out onto the lake. He's going to have to come back for water, the warden said. Stanley noticed Zero's canteen lying on the ground near his hole. A couple of the counselors helped Mr. Pendanski to his feet and into the truck. Stanley looked out toward Zero, but he had disappeared into the haze. The warden ordered the counselors to take their turns guarding the shower room and rec room all day, all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water, but when he returned, he was to be brought directly to her. She examined her fingernails and said, It's almost time for me to paint my nails again. Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of Group D that she still expected 7 holes. As you listen to holes today, remember your assignment was to write down the main events that took place in your notebook. So right now, look at your notebook page, and if there's any additional events you need to write down, make sure you take the time right now to write in those events. What are the main events that took place in this chapter? And then post a picture of these events to Seesaw. Thank you, Team Persevere.